What would you do if you were a disabled veteran, betrayed by the very system you fought to protect, and faced with the impending loss of your home, your only sanctuary in the world? A home that held the final memories of a life spent in service, love, and sacrifice? William Thompson did what no one expected. He took on a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, armed only with the law, unwavering determination, and the spirit of a warrior who had fought on battlefields far more dangerous than any courtroom. This is a story of defiance, justice, and the unexpected triumph of the human spirit. When a man pushed to the edge decided he would no longer back down. The courtroom was a theater of scorn, its walls echoing with laughter that rang louder than any gavel. Judge Raymond Harrington, a man whose reputation for cutting down defendants with sarcastic remarks and biting wit was well known, leaned back in his chair, gavel loosely gripped in his hand. He scanned the room, his cold gray eyes sweeping over the defendant. There, in the middle of the courtroom, sat an old, frail man, his weathered face set in a grim mask of determination. He was in a wheelchair, dressed in a military uniform that had seen better days. His medals, once shining symbols of honor, now looked like mere trinkets, meaningless in the face of the mockery that surrounded him. The judge couldn't contain his amusement. "Let me get this straight," he scoffed, tilting his head as if the very idea before him was an absurdity. "You, a disabled veteran, think you can represent yourself in court against one of the top legal teams in the country?" The laughter that followed echoed off the walls, fueled by the condescending smiles of the lawyers on the other side. They sat in their expensive suits, their faces twisted into smirks of superiority, as if already imagining the inevitable outcome of the case. They had the money, the power, and the resources to crush this old man's fight with a flick of their hands. But William Thompson, sitting motionless in his wheelchair, made no attempt to respond to their taunts. His face remained unreadable, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, his blue eyes sharp as a hawk's. He wasn't intimidated. He didn't flinch at the laughter, nor did he respond to the sneers. Instead, he simply stared at the judge, his silence a quiet, defiant answer that hung in the air like a challenge. The room shifted. The energy in the courtroom suddenly thickened. Judge Harrington, clearly enjoying the show, chuckled and leaned back in his chair, making no effort to hide his smugness. "This should be good," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see what kind of legal genius a man who spent his life holding a rifle instead of a law book has to offer." Again, the courtroom erupted in laughter. William remained still. The laughter didn't faze him. He had been to far darker places than this, seen far worse faces than the ones mocking him now. And though he was old, frail, and confined to a wheelchair, he had something these people didn't understand. He had something they couldn't take from him: resolve. And in that moment, as the judge's smirk grew wider, William's resolve turned into something more dangerous: confidence. But it wasn't the confidence of someone who believed in luck or in chance. It was the kind of confidence earned through years of hardship, struggle, and survival. After what felt like an eternity of mockery, William finally broke the silence. His voice was calm, but it carried weight, a voice that had weathered storms far worse than any courtroom battle. "Your Honor," he said, his gaze now firmly fixed on Judge Harrington, "with all due respect, I suggest you buckle up, because by the time I'm done here, you'll see exactly why underestimating me was the biggest mistake of your life." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge's smirk faltered, the laughter from the lawyers on the other side died down, and the spectators, who had been eagerly waiting for this spectacle to play out, suddenly found themselves unsure of what to expect next. There was something in William's voice, something in the way he spoke, that made them pause. The arrogant certainty in the room, which had been palpable just moments ago, now seemed fragile, as though the ground beneath them had shifted. The judge stiffened, his posture straightening, a flicker of something, perhaps doubt, crossing his face. The lawyers exchanged glances. This wasn't part of the script. What had they just walked into? They had assumed this would be an easy win, a mere formality to dismiss the old man's case and strip him of his home. But now, in this small, quiet moment, something told them they had made a terrible mistake. The story of William Thompson, however, had truly begun long before this courtroom drama. 2 months earlier, William had sat alone on his porch, the afternoon sun slowly dipping below the horizon. His old, worn-down house sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, and life after the military had not been kind to him. The wheelchair squeaked as he shifted his weight slightly, stretching his sore arms. He had lost the use of his legs in combat, but what really hurt wasn't his legs. It was the life he had built after returning from the war. The house he lived in wasn't just a house. It was a memory. It was where his wife, God rest her soul, had spent her final days. It was where he had learned to rebuild after war, brick by brick, moment by moment. And now, after all those years of hardship, it was the one thing he had left. A letter lay on the small table beside him, the envelope crinkled from being held so many times. William had read it a dozen times, yet it still didn't seem real. A lawsuit against him. A powerful real estate company was attempting to seize his home, claiming that he had violated some obscure property law. The letter was full of legal jargon that he didn't understand, but what was clear was that they had the resources, the lawyers, and the power to take everything from him. He clenched his jaw, the anger rising in his chest. This wasn't just about a house. It was about everything he had fought for in his life. He had fought in war, sacrificed so much, and now these men in suits wanted to rip away the last thing he had, his home. The following morning, William visited the local law office, seeking help, but the lawyer shook his head, refusing to take the case. "I'm sorry, sir, but this case is too big for us," the lawyer said. "They have the best attorneys in the country. You'd need a miracle to win this." William nodded, but the weight of disappointment settled heavy on his heart. He didn't stop there. He visited another lawyer, then another, and another. Each time, the answer was the same: too powerful, too expensive, no chance. By the end of the day, William sat alone on a park bench, staring at the lawsuit papers in his hands. His wheelchair felt heavier than ever. He was out of options, and his heart felt like it was about to break. But in that moment, he made a decision. If no lawyer would stand with him, then he would stand alone. He would fight this battle himself. And fight he did. In the following weeks, William transformed his small living room into a war room. Stacks of law books, court case files, and legal notes covered every surface. He spent every waking hour studying, memorizing legal terms, and learning about property rights. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments of frustration, and his old war injuries ached from exhaustion. But he pushed through, fueled by nothing but sheer determination. One evening, his neighbor Sarah, a kind-hearted schoolteacher, knocked on his door. "Mr. Thompson, you need to rest," she said, glancing at the piles of legal documents covering the table. "I can't," William replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "If I stop now, I lose everything." Sarah sighed, but there was admiration in her eyes. "At least let me help," she said. And so, Sarah became his research partner. Each night, she read through complicated legal documents and broke them down into simpler terms. With her help, William's understanding of the law sharpened day by day. He wasn't just learning about the law, he was mastering it. The night before his court date, William sat staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him wasn't just an old soldier. He was a warrior preparing for battle. And this time, the battlefield was a courtroom. 2 months before the courtroom drama began, William Thompson sat on the front porch of his modest, worn-down house, his wheelchair creaking under his weight as he shifted slightly. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, but it failed to soften the heavy weight of worry on his chest. His eyes scanned the quiet neighborhood that surrounded him, a place he had come to call home after his return from war. Life after the military had not been kind to William. His body had been scarred by the battles he fought overseas, but it was the war that continued within him, against bureaucracy, poverty, and now, the very people who seemed to thrive on taking from those who had the least, that had become the most exhausting fight of his life. For a long time, the house had been the only place he could call his own. It was where his late wife, Jane, had spent her final days before cancer claimed her. It was where William had fought, in his own quiet way, to rebuild his life after returning from the horrors of combat. The house wasn't just a physical structure. It was a sanctuary. It was the place that held all of his memories, where the echoes of his love for Jane lingered in every corner. And now, after all that he had been through, it was under threat. A letter sat on the small wooden table beside him, its corners worn from being picked up and put down time and again. He had read the letter a dozen times, but it still felt unreal, like something that couldn't possibly apply to him. The letter informed him that Bright Future Developments, a massive real estate company, had filed a lawsuit against him. They were accusing him of violating some obscure property law, and the company was demanding that he vacate his home immediately. William clenched his jaw, reading the words again. The legalese was a blur to him, full of terms that felt more like weapons than language, but the meaning was clear. His home, his sanctuary, was being taken away. He didn't even know what the law was that they claimed he had violated. What he knew was that this wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about everything he had left in this world. He had fought in wars, but this was a different kind of fight. This time, the enemy wasn't wearing a uniform. They didn't carry rifles or grenades. They carried power, money, and influence. They had the means to wipe him out without a second thought. That evening, as the light dimmed and the crickets began to sing, William sat back in his chair and let out a long, heavy sigh. He had fought for his country, for the lives of those he cared about, but what was the point if he couldn't protect the life he had built for himself after returning? This fight wasn't just about legalities. It was about his right to live in peace, to hold on to what was his. The next morning, William wheeled himself into town. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he wasn't the kind of man who gave up without a fight. He'd been to hell and back in his life, and he wasn't about to let some corporation take what little he had left. He entered the local law office, hoping to find someone who could offer him legal counsel. But the response he received shattered his hopes. The lawyer, a young man fresh out of law school, took one look at the case details and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but this case is too big for us. The company has the best attorneys in the country, and you'd need a miracle to win this." William didn't argue. He simply nodded, feeling a sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew the odds weren't in his favor, but he refused to walk away. He visited other law offices, one after another, only to be met with the same response. Too powerful. Too expensive. No chance to be. By the time the sun was setting, William found himself alone on a park bench, staring at the lawsuit papers in his hands. His wheelchair, which had once symbolized his strength and resilience, now felt heavier than ever. He was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained. But as the cold breeze blew through the trees, he made a decision. If no lawyer would stand with him, then he would stand alone. He had fought on battlefields in distant lands, and now he would fight for his home with everything he had. The next few weeks were grueling. William transformed his small living room into a war room. Bookshelves, once filled with old war memorabilia, were now stacked with legal texts, court cases, and notepads full of scribbled notes. He spent every waking hour reading, memorizing legal terms, and learning everything he could about property law. His body ached from the hours spent hunched over piles of paperwork, but the pain was nothing compared to what he stood to lose. There were moments of doubt, moments when his mind felt like it was on the brink of breaking. The legal terms were foreign, the concepts complex. He would sometimes sit back, staring at the ceiling, feeling lost. But then, a memory would flicker. His wife's smile, the love they had shared, the years he had spent rebuilding his life after the war. He couldn't give up now. The real turning point came one evening when his neighbor, Sarah, knocked on his door. She had been watching him from across the street, and her concern had grown as the days wore on. Sarah was a schoolteacher, kind-hearted and pragmatic, and she could see how consumed William had become by the case. "You need to rest, Mr. Thompson," she said, peering into his cluttered living room, where papers were scattered everywhere. "You can't do this alone." "I can't stop now," William replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "If I stop now, I lose everything." Sarah sighed, clearly worried. But then, a glimmer of admiration appeared in her eyes. "Let me help," she said. "I may not know much about law, but I can help you read through these papers, break them down into something understandable." William hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He had no other choice. From that night on, Sarah became his research partner. Every evening, she sat beside him, reading through the complex legal documents and translating them into simpler terms. With her help, William's understanding of the law grew sharper. He wasn't just learning. He was becoming a master of the intricacies of property rights and legal defenses. With Sarah by his side, he felt less alone in this fight. The days grew longer, and the tension in William's mind increased. The court date loomed closer, and he knew that this would be his only chance. He could either fight back or watch everything he had left be taken away from him. One evening, as he sat before the mirror, reflecting on the man he had become, William knew something important. The man looking back at him wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a warrior, someone who had fought for freedom on the battlefield and would now fight for his home in a courtroom. His wheelchair no longer symbolized his weakness. It symbolized his resolve. With Sarah's help, he was ready. The fight was on. The days leading up to William Thompson's court date were a blur of endless study, exhaustion, and determination. His living room had become a war room, the piles of legal books and case files growing higher each day. He spent countless hours reading through property law, case studies, and court procedures, determined to understand every nuance of the legal system that was stacked against him. But this wasn't just about learning law, it was about survival. The house that had been his sanctuary, the last piece of his life left untouched by war, was now under threat by a corporation that viewed it as just another property to be seized. William knew that the fight ahead would be no simple task. His opponent wasn't a single man. It was a powerful, well-funded real estate empire with some of the best legal minds working for them. He had no formal legal training, no massive law firm to back him up. But what he did have was determination, a fierce will to defend what was his, and, with the help of Sarah, his devoted neighbor, an understanding of the law that far surpassed anyone's expectations. Sarah, a kind-hearted schoolteacher, had come to his aid when she saw him drowning in legal jargon. She had no legal experience, but she had the ability to simplify the complex. Every evening after her work, she would come over to William's house, sit beside him, and help break down the intricate legal language into terms he could understand. She read through case law, explained clauses, and helped William grasp the underlying principles of property rights. Over the course of weeks, William's confidence grew. He wasn't just reading the law anymore. He was learning how to use it. One evening, after Sarah had helped him break down yet another legal brief, William looked at the piles of notes on the table and felt a rare moment of hope. He wasn't just a disabled veteran anymore, preparing for a court date. He had become someone who understood his rights, someone capable of fighting back. The sense of self-worth that had once been chipped away by years of struggle and the loss of his physical abilities was beginning to return. But despite the steady progress, there were moments when doubt crept in. William wasn't a young man anymore. His body had been broken by the horrors of war, and every night he spent hunched over the books only made his joints ache more. His hands, once steady as a soldier holding a rifle, trembled from exhaustion as he turned the pages of legal textbooks. There were days when the weight of the case felt unbearable, when his muscles screamed in protest, and his mind seemed on the brink of giving up. It was during one of these low moments that Sarah noticed the change in him. One evening, she found him sitting in the dimly lit living room, his head buried in his hands. The stack of papers beside him was nearly untouched, and the light from the desk lamp seemed to cast a shadow over his tired face. "You need to rest, William," Sarah said softly, stepping into the room. "You're burning yourself out. You've been at this for weeks, and you're not getting any younger." William looked up at her, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I can't stop, Sarah," he replied, his voice hoarse. "If I stop now, they'll take everything. I'll lose my home, everything my wife and I built together. I can't let that happen." Sarah knelt beside him, her gaze full of understanding. "I know, but you're not going to win this fight if you don't take care of yourself first. You're stronger than you think, but even the strongest soldiers need to rest between battles." William sighed, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He knew Sarah was right, but he felt like he couldn't afford to take a break. He had no one else. No lawyer would represent him. No one but Sarah, who had taken time from her own life to help him, was on his side. Sarah's eyes softened as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've been fighting your whole life, William. You've fought in wars, fought for survival. This isn't any different. You've come so far already. You're going to win, but only if you take it one step at a time." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of despair. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting her reassurance wash over him. When he opened them again, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this battle. Sarah had become more than just a neighbor. She was his ally, his partner in this war for justice. Together, they would face whatever came next. The next day, William returned to the law books with a renewed focus. Sarah's words had given him the clarity he needed. He was no longer just a soldier in a war he couldn't win. He was a man with a purpose, a man who had been through far worse than this. He would not allow a corporation to take what was rightfully his, not without a fight. In the weeks that followed, William's preparation intensified. Every day, he immersed himself in legal texts. He studied property rights, zoning laws, and the intricacies of legal contracts. He learned how to question witnesses, how to present evidence, and how to challenge the opposition's claims. He spent hours memorizing key legal arguments, rehearsing them in front of his mirror until he could speak with confidence and authority. When the court date finally arrived, he was ready, not just with a solid understanding of the law, but with a newfound sense of belief in himself. The courtroom may have laughed at him when he first entered, but he was no longer the man they mocked. He was a man with knowledge, with facts, and with the will to fight for his home. Sarah, too, had grown alongside him. As the trial approached, she continued to support him, sitting with him late into the night, helping him review documents, and encouraging him when the weight of the case threatened to overwhelm him. She had become his emotional anchor, reminding him that this fight was more than just about the house. It was about standing up to the system that had failed so many others, about proving that justice could prevail, even when the odds were stacked against you. The courtroom, when it finally arrived, felt less like a place of judgment and more like a battlefield, a place where William was ready to face his enemies head-on. He had trained for this moment, and though his body was weak and his legs no longer worked as they once had, his mind was sharp. This battle wasn't about strength or speed. It was about knowledge, about truth, and William was ready to wield both like a weapon. But as he prepared for the fight of his life, there was one thing that weighed heavily on his mind. The realization that this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was the fight of every person who had been wronged by powerful corporations, every person who had been silenced, bullied, and forced to give up their homes. This was about more than just him. It was about proving that no one, no matter how small or powerless they seemed, was beyond the reach of justice. And as William wheeled himself into the courtroom on the morning of the trial, he wasn't just fighting for his home anymore. He was fighting for all the people who had been oppressed by the very system that was now trying to take everything he had left. This fight was personal, but it was also a battle for something much larger, something that no amount of money, power, or influence could take away. The real fight had just begun. The day of the trial finally arrived, and William Thompson wheeled himself into the courtroom with a determined yet calm expression on his face. The air was thick with anticipation as the courtroom buzzed with whispers. People couldn't quite believe their eyes. An elderly disabled veteran in a wheelchair, preparing to represent himself in a court case against one of the most powerful real estate companies in the country. It was an absurd scenario to most, a spectacle that was bound to end in failure. Or so they thought. William's military uniform, though worn and faded, carried with it the honor and pride of a man who had served his country. His medals, once gleaming symbols of valor, now seemed irrelevant in the face of corporate power. But for William, those medals represented more than just past achievements. They symbolized resilience. And he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. As he entered the courtroom, the laughter from the spectators was immediate. They saw him as a joke, a relic from a bygone era, trying to fight a modern, well-funded corporate machine. But William paid no mind to their mockery. His eyes were set on one thing: justice. And it didn't matter who doubted him. The lawyers from Bright Future Developments, led by Richard Sullivan, were already seated at the plaintiff's table, their expensive suits reflecting the bright courtroom lights. They looked more like a group of sharks circling their prey than legal professionals, their confident smirks betraying their belief that this case would be an easy win. Sullivan, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in the fact that he was facing an opponent he perceived as no match for his firm's power. His smile grew wider as he glanced over at William, dismissing him as a non-threat. Judge Raymond Harrington, the man who would oversee the trial, was a seasoned veteran of the courtroom. He leaned forward in his chair, his gavel resting lazily in his hand as he surveyed the room. The judge's cold, calculating eyes scanned William, and he seemed almost entertained by the absurdity of it all. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Harrington began, his voice laced with sarcasm, "you're representing yourself? Against a team of the finest legal minds in the country?" William nodded without hesitation, his face unreadable. The laughter that followed only fueled his resolve. He wasn't here for the theatrics or the spectacle. He was here for the truth, and he would fight for it, no matter how hard they tried to laugh him out of the room. As the proceedings began, Sullivan wasted no time. He rose to his feet, addressing the court with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. "Your Honor, we believe this case is clear," he said, his tone oozing arrogance. "Mr. Thompson is in violation of multiple property laws, and we demand immediate action to remove him from his home." William, sitting in his wheelchair, remained silent. He could feel the weight of their condescension, the smirks that burned into his skin like daggers. But he knew better than to react. This was just the beginning of his defense. He had prepared for this moment. He wasn't about to let them bulldoze him into submission. The judge turned to William, clearly amused by the idea that a man in his condition could possibly challenge the powerful legal team standing before him. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Harrington drawled, "you're choosing to represent yourself, is that right?" "Yes, Your Honor," William replied, his voice steady and unwavering. The judge's eyes narrowed, but before he could say anything further, William spoke up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Before we proceed, I would like to ask the plaintiff's counsel a few questions." The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. The smirks that had been plastered on Sullivan's team's faces began to fade. There was something in William's tone that made them pause, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Sullivan, caught off guard, shot up from his seat, ready to object. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. The defendant cannot cross-examine the plaintiff's counsel." Judge Harrington's gaze shifted to William, who was calm and unshaken. "Proceed, Mr. Thompson," the judge said, his tone less sure than before. He had underestimated this man, but now something in his demeanor told him that William was not the joke everyone thought he was. William adjusted his wheelchair slightly and then addressed Sullivan, who was standing, visibly annoyed by the interruption. "Mr. Sullivan," William said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the courtroom, "under which statute are you claiming that I am in violation of the law?" Sullivan blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He hesitated, clearly unprepared for such a precise inquiry. "Well, under multiple property codes and municipal regulations," he stammered, clearly unsure of the specifics. "Which one specifically?" William pressed. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Sullivan's, refusing to let him off the hook. Sullivan hesitated again, his face growing red as he fumbled through his notes. "We don't need to get into that level of detail right now," he muttered, clearly rattled by William's calm and precise questioning that William's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Oh, I think we do," he said. "If your case is as solid as you claim, you should have no problem citing the exact law." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Sullivan's confidence began to crack. He quickly flipped through his legal binder, his fingers moving frantically. The audience could sense the shift in power. For the first time, the legal team's polished exterior was starting to show cracks, and the room fell into an eerie silence. A full minute passed before Sullivan finally looked up, his face flushed with frustration. "We'll provide that information later," he muttered, defeated that William's smile widened. He had done it. He had exposed the flaw in their case. A simple question had unraveled their entire argument. The laughter from the courtroom began again, this time at Sullivan's expense. The lead attorney's face was pale, his arrogance deflated. Judge Harrington, who had been tapping his fingers on the desk in annoyance, now seemed visibly irritated. "Mr. Sullivan," he said sternly, "I expect you to have your legal citations ready for the next session. We won't waste any more time on this." Sullivan nodded stiffly, his face contorted in anger. He had been outmaneuvered by a man in a wheelchair, someone he had dismissed as a non-threat. The power dynamic had shifted, and now it was William who had control, but William wasn't done yet. He had only just begun to show them that he wasn't the easy target they had believed him to be. "Your Honor," William said, his voice steady and firm. "If I may, I have a few more things I'd like to present to the court." He reached into his folder and pulled out a stack of papers. He held them up for the judge to see. "This," he said, "is a record of my property deed, signed, stamped, and legally approved 25 years ago." He handed it over to the clerk, who brought it to the judge. William watched as Judge Harrington skimmed the document, his expression unreadable. "This," William continued, holding up another document, "is a record showing every property tax payment I've made since then, paid in full, on time. No violations." A few gasps rippled through the room as William laid out his evidence, proving that he had been in full compliance with every aspect of the law. And finally, William said, pulling out one more paper, "This is a copy of the original zoning law they claim I violated. The only problem is," he paused, letting the suspense build, "the law they're using to evict me wasn't passed until 3 years after I bought my house." The room went completely silent. Sullivan's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and the judge's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. William had just exposed the entire foundation of their case. Not only was the law they were using irrelevant, but it also didn't even apply to him. William sat back in his chair, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, the tide had turned. He had outmaneuvered some of the best lawyers in the country, and the courtroom knew it. The judge glanced up at Sullivan. His expression was no longer one of amusement. It was one of doubt. The arrogant legal team was starting to realize that they had underestimated their opponent. And as the case progressed, it became clear William Thompson wasn't just fighting for his home. He was fighting for something much larger. The courtroom was charged with a strange electricity after William Thompson's unexpected victory. He had proven the weakness of Bright Future Development's case with one swift move. But as the dust settled and the murmurs of disbelief faded, William knew the battle wasn't over. His opponents were far from finished. They were ruthless, and their next moves would be even more desperate. William sat at the defendant's table, his gaze steady and unshaken. He could hear the low hum of whispered conversations around the courtroom, the lawyers on the other side conferring in tense huddles. Despite his success, he was fully aware that the fight wasn't just about law anymore. It was a fight for survival. The judge, Raymond Harrington, adjourned the session for a brief recess. The room felt almost too quiet, like the calm before a storm. William wheeled himself toward the back of the courtroom, not acknowledging the curious stares and speculative glances. He wasn't here for anyone's approval. He was here for justice. And as the attorneys on the other side began to regroup, he could sense their frustration mounting. They had underestimated him once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. When the court reconvened, William rolled back to his seat, his mind sharp, his focus absolute. He wasn't expecting a smooth continuation. No, his instincts told him that something more sinister was brewing beneath the surface. And he was right. The moment Judge Harrington called the court to order, Richard Sullivan, the lead attorney for Bright Future Developments, stood up abruptly. His usual confident demeanor had cracked, replaced by something more dangerous, anger. "Your Honor," Sullivan began, his voice dripping with feigned composure, "we've uncovered disturbing new information that casts doubt on the legitimacy of Mr. Thompson's property deed." He presented a thick folder, holding it up for the judge and the courtroom to see. "The documents he has provided show discrepancies in the notary's signatures, irregularities in the stamp placement. These are not minor errors. They are clear indicators of forgery." Gasps echoed through the room. William's heart skipped a beat, but he refused to let fear take root. He had expected something like this. The last desperate attempt to discredit him. The judge, flipping through the folder with a keen eye, looked up after a moment. "These claims are serious, Mr. Sullivan," Judge Harrington said, his voice more neutral than before. He had, after all, seen enough of the case to know that the game was changing. William sat still, his face betraying nothing, but inside, a storm was raging. It wasn't just his home at stake now. It was his very integrity. the truth he had so painstakingly fought for. This was no longer a battle for property rights. This was a battle to expose the truth behind the underhanded tactics of a corporation willing to go to any lengths to destroy him. He raised his hand, catching the judge's attention. "Your Honor, if I may respond to this accusation." Judge Harrington nodded, signaling for him to proceed. William turned toward the prosecutor's table, his eyes locking with Sullivan's. "Mr. Sullivan," he began, his voice calm and controlled, "you accuse me of forgery. You claim that my property deed contains irregularities in the notary's signatures and stamp placement. Yet, you fail to understand that these discrepancies are a direct result of standard legal processes." Sullivan opened his mouth to interject, but William raised a hand, stopping him. "If you were as familiar with property law as you claim to be, you would know that deeds are sometimes re-recorded, especially when tax payments are updated or property modifications occur. Every time a property undergoes a change, the deed may be re-stamped and signed again. These minor variations are not proof of forgery. They are proof of the maintenance of legal records over time." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The defense had expected to be blindsided by this accusation, but now, with a simple explanation, William had turned the tables once again. Sullivan's face reddened, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find a response. But there was none. Judge Harrington, who had been reviewing the documents, finally spoke. "Mr. Sullivan, unless you have actual evidence to support these forgery claims, I suggest you cease wasting the court's time. Mr. Thompson has provided legitimate records, and these accusations are unfounded." Sullivan opened his mouth again, but the judge cut him off with a sharp look. "We will proceed," Harrington said sternly, "and I expect no further distractions." The tension in the courtroom remained thick, but for the first time in the trial, Sullivan was on the back foot. He sat down, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had tried to turn the tide with his fabricated accusations, but William had blocked him at every turn, proving that the case against him was based on lies. But Sullivan wasn't ready to give up just yet. He knew that if he couldn't beat William in the courtroom, he would have to find another way to win. And that's when the real dirty tactics began. The next morning, as William wheeled himself into the courthouse parking lot, he noticed something strange. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance. Police officers, reporters, and onlookers. He couldn't quite make out what was happening, but a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach told him that something was wrong. As he got closer, the unease turned to alarm. Two uniformed officers approached him, their hands resting on their belts, their eyes locked on him as if he were the criminal they were here to apprehend. "Mr. Thompson," one of the officers said, his tone flat, "we need to speak with you outside." The entire courtroom went silent as the officers moved in. William's heart pounded, but he kept his face calm. He knew exactly what was happening. This was a setup, an attempt to distract him, to drag him down with baseless charges. He had seen it all before, in the battlefields of war. This was just another battle, and he wasn't about to let them win. "Officer," William said, his voice steady, "if you have evidence of any wrongdoing, then show it. But if this is just a baseless accusation, then I'll be on my way to the courtroom. I'm not interested in wasting any more time on these games." The officers hesitated, clearly taken aback by his response. The lead officer glanced at his partner, then back at William. "We received an anonymous tip," the officer said reluctantly, "that your documents may have been forged. We need to question you about it." "Anonymous tip?" William repeated, his voice sharp. "Is that your evidence? You're accusing me of fraud based on an anonymous tip? I don't think so." He turned to Judge Harrington, who had been watching the exchange unfold. "Your Honor, are you really going to allow this to happen? Do you see the tactics they are using to distract us from the truth?" Judge Harrington, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "If there is no concrete evidence, then these proceedings will continue as planned. I will not tolerate any further interruptions." The officers exchanged a brief look before stepping back, clearly unwilling to escalate the situation further. William, keeping his composure, wheeled himself back toward the courtroom. He had not only withstood their dirty tactic, but he had turned it to his advantage. exposing the lengths to which his opponents would go to try and undermine him. William re-entered the courtroom. The murmurs of the crowd died down. He was back in control, and his opponents knew it. The game had changed. Sullivan's desperate attempt to throw him off balance had failed, and William's confidence was unshaken. But the fight was far from over. Sullivan's next move would be his most desperate yet, and William knew it. He was ready. The courtroom was packed as the case continued, but there was a new sense of anticipation in the air. William Thompson, despite the obstacles and the ridicule, was no longer just a man defending his home. He had become something much larger, a symbol of justice and perseverance in the face of overwhelming power. His opponents, once so confident, now sat on edge, wary of the battle that was unfolding before them. William knew the fight wasn't over. Though his legal arguments had exposed the weaknesses of Bright Future Development's case, he had no illusions about how far they would go to win. He had seen their desperation and their willingness to bend the truth to their advantage. But what they didn't understand was that William had something far more powerful than money or influence. He had the truth. As the court reconvened, Judge Harrington looked more than a little weary. He had seen enough games played in his courtroom, and the showmanship of the opposing counsel was beginning to wear thin. His eyes flicked over to the defense table, where Richard Sullivan, the lead lawyer for Bright Future Developments, was sitting with his team, trying to regain his composure. Sullivan's earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by frustration and a barely controlled anger. He could sense the tide turning, but he still wasn't ready to give up. He had one last trick up his sleeve, one final dirty tactic to try. "Your Honor," Sullivan began, standing up with an air of exaggerated seriousness, "we have uncovered new evidence that calls into question Mr. Thompson's entire case." He raised his hand, holding up a thick stack of papers. "We believe that these documents provide clear evidence of Mr. Thompson's attempt to mislead the court. We demand a full investigation into the authenticity of his records." William remained silent, his face unreadable. He had anticipated this. He had known that the more desperate Sullivan became, the more ruthless his tactics would be. The accusation was baseless, but Sullivan was banking on the idea that he could drag the case out long enough to exhaust William and his supporters. This was his final move, the last card he could play. But William wasn't going to let them get away with it. He turned toward Judge Harrington, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, I request that you dismiss these allegations as they have no merit. These are nothing but another attempt to distract us from the facts." Judge Harrington, who had grown tired of the repeated attempts to undermine William, didn't even look at Sullivan. His eyes remained fixed on William. "Mr. Thompson is correct," the judge said, his voice decisive. "I will not allow this case to be derailed by baseless accusations. We will proceed with the trial, and I expect both parties to present their evidence and arguments accordingly." Sullivan's face turned crimson with anger, but he knew better than to continue arguing. His gambit had failed. His only remaining option was to continue presenting his case, hoping that somewhere, somehow, he could find a crack in William's defense. But as the trial wore on, it became clear that Sullivan's arguments were crumbling. The more he spoke, the more he exposed the holes in his case. William's cross-examination, calm and methodical, tore down every claim that Sullivan and his team made. The seasoned attorneys who had once seemed so invincible now looked unsteady, and the audience could sense that something big was about to happen. The final blow came when William presented a new piece of evidence, one that had been quietly secured over the past few days. It was a legal precedent from a Supreme Court case that directly contradicted the argument that Bright Future Developments had based their entire case on. This legal precedent proved that the zoning laws they were using to try to evict William didn't apply to properties purchased before the law was passed. Sullivan, who had been confident just moments earlier, now looked defeated. His face went pale as the reality of his situation set in. He had no way to counter this new evidence. For the first time, he realized that he had no case left to stand on. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as William calmly laid out the facts. His legal knowledge, honed over weeks of intense study, had made him a formidable adversary, and now it was paying off. He had not only defended his home, but he had exposed the greed and corruption of the real estate empire trying to take it from him. Judge Harrington, who had been observing the proceedings carefully, finally spoke. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice firm, "I find no merit in your case. The evidence presented by Mr. Thompson is both thorough and compelling. You have failed to substantiate your claims, and I am considering a motion to dismiss." Sullivan's face contorted with rage, but he had no recourse. He couldn't fight the weight of the facts. And as the judge raised his gavel, the courtroom held its breath. "Motion to dismiss granted," Judge Harrington declared, his voice final. "The case is dismissed, and Mr. Thompson's property remains in his possession. Any further attempts to challenge this ruling will be met with the full force of the law." A wave of shock washed over the courtroom. The audience, which had once ridiculed William, now stood in stunned silence. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. And then, as the realization of the victory set in, a wave of applause broke out. But William didn't join in the celebration. He sat quietly, his hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair, his gaze fixed on the floor. The fight had been long and hard, but it wasn't just his home he had won. It was the belief that justice could still prevail, no matter how powerful the opposition. For William, the victory wasn't about winning in court. It was about proving that the law could still protect the powerless, that a single person, no matter how old or broken, could stand up to the system and win. As the courtroom emptied, William wheeled himself out, his head held high. But there was no victory dance, no triumphant fist raised in the air. His battle had taken a toll on him, physically and emotionally, but he had done what he set out to do. He had defended his home, and he had exposed the truth for all to see. Outside the courthouse, the reporters swarmed, eager to capture the moment. They had expected a simple, humiliating defeat for the old veteran, but now they were faced with an entirely different story. A story of resilience, of justice, and of a man who refused to be pushed aside. As he wheeled himself toward his van, Sarah, his loyal friend and neighbor, walked beside him. She had been with him every step of the way, helping him navigate the complexities of the case and providing the emotional support he needed. "You did it," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with pride. "You really did it." William looked up at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We did it," he corrected. "This wasn't just my fight. It was everyone who believes in justice." The next morning, William awoke to the sound of hammers and saws outside his window. His home, the place he had fought so hard to protect, was being rebuilt. And as the construction workers worked alongside volunteers from the community, William knew that this was the real victory. The system might have been stacked against him, but in the end, it wasn't just about his house. It was about the fight for what was right. As the sun rose over his property, William sat in his wheelchair, watching the work unfold. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a moment of peace. His battle had been won, but the fight for justice was never truly over. He had done his part. Now it was time for the world to see that no one, no matter their background or circumstances, should ever have to fight alone. And as the sound of construction filled the air, William felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope.